Marilyn and George, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. So great to have you with us.
Our pleasure.
Great to be here.
Yes, and Richard here as well, of course. Very excited to have you on because we've published an excerpt from your fabulous new book, which we've already talked about in our introduction. We have said you're one step away from sort of God, so there's a lot of expectation on you. But it is a wonderful book, and I'm so pleased. And I was saying to you before we came on air that I wish I had that when I was a dad. I would have been much better. So, but perhaps just doing that basic sort of thing of how this is built up, how that book came about, your connections with Steve. Would you guys like to just sort of, in your own tandem, tell us the story?
Sure. So, George, I'll start, and then you can just jump in like we typically do. So, my connection to Steve Porges started in 2012 when a friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist, Jeff Magnavita, gave me the book, the first book, the 2011 book, and he asked me if I would be willing to review it for his journal, the Journal of Unified Psychotherapy. He said, I think it'll be right up your alley. And I was immediately grabbed by Polyvagal Theory and the way Polyvagal Theory made sense for me of so many things in my practice that I had viscerally known or felt, but did not necessarily have a theoretical framework for. So I wrote the review. A couple of years later, I had the opportunity to meet Steve, introduce myself to him. Anybody who's ever spoken to Steve knows that he's the world's most gracious human being. I gave him a copy of my review. He put it on his website. About a year later, I attended a 5-day seminar that he did in what it used to be called the Cape Cod Institute, a lovely place where you could go and sort of meet the researcher or the author. And we got into sort of a repartee, and we stayed in touch. And then, George, what year was it, do you think, that we met? Probably, do you have a marker for that?
I'm thinking 2017, something like that, 16.
Okay, that sounds about right. So then George and I were introduced by Deb Dana, whom I'm sure your entire audience knows. And we had a really nice time and talked about a lot of things. And in 2018, I submitted a book proposal to Norton and got back the best email I've ever gotten from the editor, which said, this was supposed to be a rejection email, but I can't. Not yet. And basically, she felt that my focus, which I had intended to be newborn intensive care, was too narrow, and said that if I was interested in broadening the focus, and if that involved taking on a co-author, that was fine. They would be interested. So, enter George. I turned to George and said, are you willing to be my co-author? Now I'm going to let you take it from there, George.
Well, I learned about polyvagal theory from Dan Hughes, the creator of dyadic developmental psychotherapy, in his training, because I'm a child psychiatrist, and I was learning about how do you help kids form bonds of attachment when they've experienced early childhood trauma, and they've taken the route of basic mistrust instead of basic trust that Erik Erikson described. And as I was learning about that, Dan talked to us about polyvagal theory, which I had never heard of before. This was also 2012, and I was very excited about it because it explained a lot of things about the work that I was doing with kids. And it also explained some things that I was seeing and working with medical students on interviewing their patients. I had a group of medical students that they really didn't understand why they should learn about communication. One of them said, I've been talking since I was 2. Why do I need a course in talking?
Oh, yes.
So I needed to answer that question. You know, I needed a good way of explaining it to them. And talking to them about the polyvagal theory was actually very helpful because it gave them a neurobiological explanation. And the ones that tended to say that were more interested in the science of medicine rather than the humanism of medicine. And so adding in polyvagal theory to that course really captured a lot of the students' attention that before had not been so interested in it. And so I met Steve at a conference in 2015 and said, hey, I've been teaching medical students about your theory, and it's been really helpful. Do you want to write an article together? And he said, within 90 seconds of meeting, how about you write a chapter for my book? And that's the book that Marilyn and I both had chapters in. And as she said, Dana introduced us to each other and said, you guys will like each other. And it was, we really enjoyed our conversations from that moment on. And then when she called and said, hey, you want to write a book together? I was like, that sounds great. And that's how we got started.
It's a beautiful story and a beautiful thing that it's these connections and engagements that go beyond the hello, nice to meet you, it's beautiful to see that happening, because I remember, just with Ernest Rossi, I went up and said hello along with several billion other people, and it was when I kept coming. I think it was about the 4th or 5th year. He thought, this guy's not going away. And so that same thing with you, but Stephen's always been so incredibly generous and inclusive. It really is just another wonderful tale of his comfort and his co-comfort. And this is something that segues a little segue into what we were sort of featuring in the chapter 6, but that really important aspect of polyvagal theory that goes in there's self-regulation, but there's co-regulation, and how important this is with kids. Parents and kids, teachers and kids, adults and kids. And this is what you've brought out in the book. So can we just, tease out just some of the salient points there? I'd love to hear that, what we're thinking in your head as you brought it all through.
So when we wrote our introduction, we wrote an introduction that was actually very personal in nature, I would say, George, right? Yeah. We talked about the fact, and actually I think you were the ones who wrote these words, that we both care for populations of children who are ill-equipped to be in this world. My population of children, babies who are in newborn intensive care, are born too early. They have immature organ systems. And George's population of children, because they have come into this sort of state of mistrust, are also unable to be in this world. And so I think that for me, the things that were the most salient were, first of all, giving me a framework for what to me had really been kind of the bulwark of my work, which is being able to engage with families who are in the worst crisis of their life. They don't choose me. I just happen to be the neonatologist who's on when their baby is born. And I noticed over the years how I had just been able to connect with people in ways that it just wasn't clear to me why it was working like it was. And I think polyvagal theory helped me understand that. And I've always been very closely connected to the mental health community in our town. And over time, I have learned that, being therapeutic is not something that is owned by psychiatry and psychology. So many caregivers in so many different dimensions can be therapeutic if they take the time. Take it away, George.
Well, and what I would say too is that, there's a lot of talk about coping skills these days and learning coping skills. And one of the things from polyvagal theory that's really important to understand is that we first learn to cope and to regulate ourselves in relationship. And co-regulation actually comes way before self-regulation. And so for the kids that Marilyn and I work with, they haven't had that co-regulation to start with. And so then they can't do self-regulation. It's the same as asking a a 9-month-old to use their coping skills. That would be silly to do that, right? They're there in their high chair throwing their green beans on the floor, and tell them to count to 10, but they don't know how to do any of that. Well, we actually are all in a state of co-regulation all of the time. And it's not something that we grow out of. We add an ability to self-regulate, but we're actually co-regulating each other all of the time. And one of the things that Marilyn and I discovered as we talked with each other is that in the neonatal intensive care unit, that team is co-regulating each other as they're in this high pressure, high stress environment of life and death situation. But also in a residential facility where there's kids that can blow up at any minute, that team needs to co-regulate each other too. So we have both co-regulation of a group of adults that are working with kids, and then the co-regulation that the adults do with the kids as well. And then there's the family situation where parents are co-regulating each other and co-regulating the children too.
And I would say that there's a natural intuitive understanding of this co-regulation, but I think what is valuable is this concrete scientific framework, like you were saying, that Stephen has brought to the table in the medical profession. That when like you were saying, George, I've been talking all my life. Why do I need to learn about communication? And here we have something that, like you said, piqued their interest, and saw that it is extremely valuable because of the scientific underpinnings, I guess.
And I can't overstress that, Matthew, because many people talk about co-regulation. Many people talk about social engagement. Many people talk about connecting. But what a lot of those people do is to overlook the physiologic component of it. And that's what Steve is focused on. That it's not just being nice to each other. It's not just having a good time together. That what is happening is that our physiology, in a dyadic way that is going back and forth, is setting the platform from which our emotions and our behaviors evolve or arise. And that's really important to understand. And I think one of the other things that I think is really sort of a salient point about polyvagal theory is that when you understand the hierarchy, the social engagement being at the top of the hierarchy, the mobilization, fight or flight being in the middle, and then of course the immobilization being at the very bottom, then it becomes easier to not be blaming in your assessments of people, assessments of behaviors, so that the question, and this is sort of a mantra of people involved in polyvagal theory, is it's not what's wrong, it's what happened. So that now, a parent in the unit who might be viewed by other people as difficult, for example, that's the word, difficult or challenging, becomes more understandable when you understand that there is a child at home that she's missing, or there are stresses that are financial or pandemic related or whatever that is causing her to feel unsafe, so that she has a neuroception of danger, and from which that behavior results. And I find many times when we address that, when we say, it must be awful to be in your shoes, to have a 9-year-old at home that you're missing, to be schlepping an hour each day, each way to come see your baby, how terrible that must be for you, how much additional stress that must put on you, as opposed to, well, they never come to see the baby.
Yeah. So an understanding that there's actually algorithms running here, they run by rules. And if we understand them, then we're going to have a lot more empathy, a lot more deeper understanding.
Yes, and that thing that as we do these sort of judgmental stuff, these sort of cognitive, superficial judgments, because what I was thinking is we talk about co-regulation, there's also co-dysregulation. And which, of course, is why another reason why the book is there, saying that if you shift from here, and Deb Dana's work does so beautifully. She sort of describes, so you might be doing this, but how about you do this? And you do quite a lot of that in the book. And George, you obviously have got that attention with some of the really dysfunctional families that you deal with.
And I think it's very helpful to think of the brain as having a mind of its own, and the autonomic nervous system is sort of like that mind of its own that we're not consciously operating, at least before we start to learn about these things. And so when we have that perspective, then we can start to ask ourselves, what is my nervous system doing right now? How is my nervous system? What does it need? If it's a little keyed up. And I'm thinking of it not as much as what do I need? Because it doesn't really feel that way. It feels like something a little separate from me. And then it's easier to not take it personally and not be so judgmental. Or what is my child's nervous system doing right now? How's my child's nervous system responding to this set of circumstances? And what might I do to help their nervous system feel a little safer and calmer?
And I want to emphasize, neither George nor I are saints, right?
Darn.
No, I'm sorry. I know you thought that you were going to get to talk to a saint tonight, but I tell you, we are not saints. We slip up. But I think that when you take this forward and when it becomes your everyday way of looking at yourself in the world over time, you definitely see changes. And I've certainly seen changes in other staff in my unit. I'm very close to, for example, my nursing director, and she will often say to me, I thought about polyvagal theory when I was addressing this, whatever it was, with a staff member, because she's under siege, right? She's under siege. She's got people coming at her all day in every way. So, there's a rain out effect, a positive rain out effect in your environment.
As we were working on the book, I was sharing some of the chapters with my mother, who's a retired school principal, and her husband is a retired electrical engineer who built fighter jets, and they were really interested in the polyvagal theory. And at one point, my mother said, I wonder if this is why this lady in my Bible study group is grouchy. And maybe instead of telling her, don't be so grouchy, I should find out what's going on with her. And it just made me so happy that the theory could get so easily applied to a very practical situation in an everyday life that somebody could actually take some action on right away and change their relationship and their understanding of each other.
Yes, and shift that situation from discomfort to the seeking safety and achieving safety. I know in the chapter that we've published, but then also in other areas of the book, you talk and give lovely case examples and discussions of particular experiences where there was a difficulty, and then sort of how things were going sour, but how to make them take them back to the sweet sort of area. And this neuroception, we've mentioned that word, that non-conscious scanning of the environment for safety. So whether you need to move yourself into sympathetic, or whether you move yourself into parasympathetic, or whether you stay in social, and all these beautiful things that you've teased out there. But it's those areas where, and I think what was the quote that I really loved? It's not safety is more than the absence of danger or risk. Yeah. And you gave some examples, and I in my education masters, I looked at Erin Gruen and the Freedom Writers, and looked at those people that lived in environments that were in themselves filled with potential threat. and those sorts of things. How's this working? Because I can imagine in your situation, Marilyn, I mean, there's the threat constantly that the child might die. And George, in some of the people who are dealing with these fearful, perhaps domestic violence cases, can you give us a couple of sort of instances of, real instances that can give us a felt sense a bit more?
Sure. First of all, that particular piece was something that was very dear to me, because in medicine, after the Institute of Medicine report, to err is human, there has been so much focus on harm reduction in hospitals. Okay? And it's as if, preventing infections and, what the outcomes are from cardiothoracic surgeries and how many times the surgeon has to go back in or whatever. It's as if that has become sort of the mantra of the harm reduction in the United States. But people don't think about other harms. And it's not just about how many central line infections do we have. So one of the vignettes in there is me. Actually, several are. And the vignette in which Donna, who's a real nurse, and I told her that I had done this, questions the young resident about the dose that she had written. That's me. That was in a neonatal intensive care rotation, and I had written a dose of a medication, and Donna came up to me and said, "Marilyn, I'm looking at this order. Is this really the dose you intend to give?" And I looked at it and I went, "Oh my God, no, it's not." And because she was so gracious, so sort of inquisitive, curious, is this what you really want to do? It gave me the permission to look, to immediately recognize my mistake and go, "Oh my God, thank you so much for finding that." Because just imagine if she had come on like gangbusters, if she had been accusatory. I never trust you residents. I check everything you do, blah, 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 blah. I mean, even though I'm sure I would have corrected my mistake, I would have walked away feeling really differently about myself as a doctor than I did. All right, George, I'm tossing it to you.
Yeah, so safety in each of the three states is really different. So in fight flight, we might think safety is my ability to go it alone and defend myself from whatever threat is coming. And safety in the dorsal vagal state is my ability to withdraw to the point where I'm at safety. But safety for humans, most of the time, ought to be our ability to be with each other. And so that quote you were talking about, safety isn't the absence of danger. We can think about safety as the being in the presence of a trusted, connected other, and that's what Marilyn is talking about in that situation. The nurse that was helping her was a trusted, connected other that helped her through something that would feel dangerous, to have made a mistake that could potentially have serious consequences. And so the parents that I work with, a similar kind of thing. They may still be in threatening situations, but one mom I'm thinking of in particular who presented her lived experience at a conference that I chaired, talked about, her village, and the people around her in the residential facility that became part of her team in raising her kid and handling the different dangers that were going on. And so she had this group of trusted other people that she could really rely on. And so the threat didn't become smaller, but the ability to manage the threat was vastly enlarged by building a community of people who could count on each other in this kind of social engagement system, and then meet any threat that comes up.
And isn't that what happens in psychotherapy all the time, where we might not be able to, and most of the time we can't reduce the external threat, but because we are a trusted connection, the resource, the capacity of the other to face those threats becomes much greater.
Absolutely.
And there's interesting research from the social baseline theory. People, for example, a study of asking people to look at a hill and tell you how steep it is. And if you also ask them standing next to somebody that they've known for a while to say how steep the hill looks, then they say it doesn't look as steep. And the longer they've known each other or the more they trust each other, the less steep the hill looks. And I think that we're hardwired to see that we're more capable together than we are individually.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is this beautiful aspect of rapport, but of co-creation of the therapeutic experience. That as you do that rapport, that's really just enabling. One of the things is, as you say, it's enabling the client to actually believe in their resources, but also heighten their sensitivity to them, which of course makes the challenge just seem manageable. And then which of course is what Bandura was talking about, is how do we achieve self-efficacy? So Polyvagal has given us a greater sense that we can, by co-regulating and co-creating experiences, we can actually just, with a snap of a finger, we can create an ease towards self-efficacy. That's fascinating. And the word I'm hearing also, because I manage to write quite a bit with people and work people in the social work area. So this is really, and I think this comes back to your title, where you saw we're talking about healthy brains, we're talking about healthy kids, we're talking about healthy families, but it's also healthy communities, which is what you have in your subtitle. So this work with the broader aspect, how's that happening?
So I think that there is a broader community of individuals at this point who are beginning to understand polyvagal theory and see the applicability to the work that they do. So there clearly is a movement at this point across a number of different disciplines. Probably the largest so far is social work. And that relates to the marvelous work that Deb Dana has done.
Yeah.
But in addition to Deb's work, there are groups of physicians who are now getting together to meet to talk about things such as, well, how can we incorporate polyvagal theory into medical school curricula? How can we incorporate it into other aspects of training? We had the Polyvagal Summit this past year that was very well attended from folks who came from a number of different disciplines. So, there needs to be a culture of connection that emerges in this very, very difficult time in the world. I mean, I don't know, I suppose maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis for me might have been the scariest time that I've ever dealt with in my life. The Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe the murder of Anwar Sadat, because I thought the Middle East was going to go up in flames. I mean, those were relatively short-lived, a few days, and the world didn't end. This world of the pandemic and climate change and the real threats throughout the world in a number of different hotspot areas create this continuous, ongoing, pervasive sense of dis-ease.
Yes.
And I think polyvagal theory and the social engagement that it fosters and the opportunities to reach across to others are something that, at least to me, because I have to remain optimistic because it's my nature, hold great promise in terms of getting us through, certainly getting us through pandemic, no question about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would say that another area that's a larger focus is people that are recognizing the application of the polyvagal theory at an organizational level.
Yes.
And so at organizations I've worked with and other organizations like Marilyn's unit or a group that's in Arizona, in New Mexico, these are places where they want to embed and embody an understanding of polyvagal theory as an aspect of changing the culture so that the culture itself supports a sense of safety for everybody, and that the culture becomes therapeutic as well. So that if you are in an environment where psychological safety is valued, recognized, and actively nurtured, that's a very different environment than like what Marilyn is talking about, the dis-ease in the world. And you feel like a feeling of coming home when you're in a situation like that. And I think that's arisen spontaneously or out of other kinds of intentions. But when we understand the polyvagal theory, we can be even more deliberate about creating that kind of culture that promotes therapeutic effects of our relationships with each other.
You know, one of the things I value more than any other is my patients' families feeling like they are in good hands. It's also me in that little vignette with the mother. And we very deliberately named, George did it, very deliberately named the organization that he was building in the book that Polyvagal informed in good hands, or good hands. Because, you know, if we're looking at that issue of danger is more than the absence of risk, what we really want, whether it is in the psychotherapeutic realm, in the residential setting, in the newborn intensive care unit, across healthcare, in the classroom. I mean, we all want to feel that we're in good hands and that our children are in good hands and the people we care about are in good hands. And I think at this point, there's so much misunderstanding and suspicion and, just the impact of pandemic, for example. You go into an emergency room because you think you're having a heart attack and you meet people who look like they're coming out of E.T., right?
Yeah.
It looks like that horrifying scene in E.T.
Yeah, and we won't go there. But of course, we all know the disagreements and displeasures and crazy things that go on. The politics don't help. There actually, but we won't. We won't.
What I would say about it is that you can see any kind of division where there's two groups of people opposing each other. Both groups feel that their way of looking at things and their solutions are ways of moving towards safety. And so if we start to understand that, then we can say, we all want safety here. This is something we can agree on. Maybe we don't agree on the cause of the threat, and maybe we don't agree on how we move towards safety, but we all want to move towards safety. And then we can start to brainstorm, how do we do that together rather than in opposition with each other, because opposing each other doesn't increase our safety.
Yes, it's a fundamental of polyvagal theory in there. Absolutely. Sorry, man.
No. That's a brilliant point of common interest. George, I wanted to know how in the world of psychiatry, polyvagal theory is catching on in your world of psychiatry.
So I think it's catching on slowly, but among the people where it's catching on, it's really on fire. Okay. So you have pockets of people that understand polyvagal theory and that it gives a language to the experience that they may have tried to explain to other people that has been hard to make sense of. I was at a conference in 2005 in which the presenter was talking to medical educators in America about compassion. And they said, how many of you have had to justify being compassionate by quoting a scientific study? And half of the people raised their hand. So there are people that are trying to implement compassionate approaches, but they need to have some sort of way of explaining what it is, what's happening. And so for those people that have that intention already, who then come across the polyvagal theory, that's a marriage made in heaven, because now they have a way of explaining what it is, what's happening. And so for those people that have that intention already, who then come across the polyvagal theory, that's a marriage made in heaven, because now they have a way of explaining explaining this in neurobiological terms, which you guys know is very effective way of understanding an aspect of human behavior, but also communicating it to other people.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, that's a beautiful sort of way of looking at that. And it does sit, and it fits into frameworks of thinking, and that is one of the curious aspects that we can keep exploring. Is why, not so much what the resistance is, but kind of what the resistance is. I wonder why that doesn't sit so well with you as it does. And this is, of course, a common discussion amongst many, many topics, of which polyvagal is certainly one of them. And I would like to see it more broadly held. But I think Matt's just sort of having a think about the time we're at, aren't we?
The time we're at, and I want to plug the book. So, Polyvagal Theory and the Developing Child. Tell us, who are you aiming to reach with the book?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of different people could read this book, but therapists for sure, because we give a number of examples of how polyvagal theory affects children from early age, and those children might show up in therapists' offices or as adults. But also the medical world, more in general, medical professionals. And then we do have some information for teachers and educators as well. And I've had a number of my friends read the book and find it helpful, even though they're not from any of these worlds. One of my friends, who's an engineer and ran a transportation department for the state that I live in, said, this is sort of the unified field theory for child development, isn't it? And I just loved his comment about that. And he's not he's not somebody that studied psychology, but that was his impression of it.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots of lovely sort of cases and examples which are readable, which are universally readable, and have a universal message through it.
That might be yes, it is easy to read. It's not a highly technical book, so just wanted to let people know that it's an easy read. And if anyone has read the excerpt from our January issue, you will be able to see that. So, yeah. Sorry, Richard.
Yeah. Now, we're sort of tickling over into our time frame of things. Now, because we get compressed in time, there are things we don't ask that are important. So what we'll ask is there anything that's important that you would have liked to have said that we haven't asked? And, if we've done quite well, what's your sort of summary? What's your leaving comments, your final gifts?
I would say that understanding the polyvagal theory allows us to be compassionate about the times we're not at our best, because we can understand what has triggered us to go into a fight-flight state or a state of withdrawal or disconnection. But we can understand it in a different way, that we don't have to feel bad about ourselves or put ourselves down for it. And it also then gives us ways of correcting for it and coming back and making a repair, to say to somebody, I wasn't in my best frame of mind there, but I'd like to try it again. Is that possible? Mm-hmm. And that's a very freeing and nurturing kind of perspective to have.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I think for myself, I would say that I find polyvagal theory a philosophy of care for my professional work. I think, we've been far too long caught in the Cartesian dualism of mind and body. Medicine has certainly suffered greatly from that. Polyvagal theory gives us a lot of insight into a lot of the chronic maladies that are worldwide in their impact and in the burden of suffering. And I would encourage people to, go online and just read. I think it's the introduction, and is it the first chapter that are online, George? I know it's the introduction, and I think a good part of the first chapter. Get a taste of it and see how you think this might apply to your own life and what insights it gives you into your own life or your work life. And I think I would leave you with that.
That's beautiful.
And if I could just say one last thing too, is that, we're talking about a theory here, but this is a theory about human connection, cooperation, collaboration. And as we work on this theory, but we're embedded in very important relationships with Steve Porges, with Deb Dana, with each other, now with you guys. And that's an aspect that's been an added benefit of doing this work, is that we've come into contact and made connection with beautiful people from around the world who really want to be in that social engagement and to open their hearts to each other. And so it doesn't end up just being a theoretical exercise, but it's really a way of building a family of interconnections across many different types of people.
Yeah, and Matt and I say, like we're trying to say in our book, we're just trying to find ways to describe what already exists. So the benefits, the biological benefits, the things that the polyvagal has a beautiful theoretical description of, they already exist. They're there. This just helps us get a little closer, a little bit more cognitively in touch with it, and confidently let our bodies free to engage with it, to free ourselves up, which is what I hear you saying, this community of going, let's just do this. Let's just let this happen rather than fight it. So that's beautiful.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Marilyn Sanders, George Thompson, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy. It's been wonderful chatting.
It's been wonderful. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.